Ma'am, I need you to move that flag. I paid for this seat and I don't want military junk cluttering my space. Have you ever witnessed someone disrespect a veteran right in front of you? That burning feeling in your chest when you know something's deeply wrong but you're frozen, unsure whether to speak up? That's exactly what 30,000 feet above Atlanta felt like on Flight 447, when Karen Lawson decided an elderly man's small American flag was ruining her travel experience. Herbert Wallace sat quietly in 14B, his weathered hands resting on a worn leather folder. The 78-year-old Vietnam veteran wore his old service cap, faded from decades of wear but still crisp with dignity. A small, carefully folded flag peeked from his jacket pocket, and a modest veteran's pin gleamed softly on his collar. Herbert wasn't bothering anyone. He'd said thank you to the flight attendant, helped an elderly woman with her carry-on, and settled into his window seat with the quiet grace of someone who'd learned to take up minimal space in the world. But Karen? Karen saw an inconvenience. "Sir, that flag is blocking my armrest space," she demanded, her voice sharp enough to slice through the cabin's gentle hum. "This is premium economy. I expect premium service." Herbert looked up from his book, a historical account of the Vietnam War, his calm brown eyes meeting her glare. "Ma'am, this flag represents the men who didn't make it home with me. I keep it close during flights. It's not in your way." "Everything about your military display is in my way," Karen snapped, gesturing dismissively at his cap, his pin, his dignity. "I don't care about your war stories. I care about my comfort." The passengers around them shifted uncomfortably. A businessman lowered his laptop. A mother pulled her child closer. Everyone could feel the tension building, but nobody knew quite what to do. Herbert simply nodded, his voice steady despite the public humiliation. "I understand you're frustrated, ma'am. I'm not trying to cause trouble." But what Herbert and everyone else on that plane didn't know was that their pilot, Captain Leonard Carter, was listening to every word through the cabin intercom. And Captain Carter? He had very strong feelings about respect for veterans. What happened next would ground an entire plane and leave 150 passengers stunned into silence. If you believe veterans deserve respect, no matter where they are, hit that like button. This story is just getting started. Herbert's fingers traced the edge of his book, a familiar coping mechanism from decades of staying calm under pressure. In 1969, when mortar shells screamed overhead in the jungles of Cu Chi, Herbert had learned that quiet strength often outlasted loud aggression. "Ma'am," he said softly, "I served 3 tours in Vietnam. Lost my best friend there, Tommy Rodriguez from Chicago. This flag was draped over his casket before his family buried him." Herbert's voice carried no anger, just the weight of memory. "I promised his mother I'd carry a piece of him wherever I went." Karen's face flushed red. Instead of backing down, she doubled down. "I don't care if you carried it to the moon and back," she hissed, loud enough for half the cabin to hear. "You're making me uncomfortable with your military obsession. Either move that flag or switch seats. I'm not sitting next to someone living in the past." The woman across the aisle, Maria Santos, a nurse from Miami, felt her stomach clench. She'd seen her own grandfather diminished by strangers who didn't understand sacrifice. Her hands gripped her armrests as she debated speaking up. 2 rows back, businessman James Chen looked up from his phone, his jaw tightening. His brother had served in Afghanistan. This felt personal. A college student named David twisted in his seat, phone ready to record, sensing something significant was building. Flight attendant Jessica Reynolds approached with her trained smile, hoping to diffuse the situation before it escalated further. "Is everything all right here?" Jessica asked, her voice professionally cheerful. "No, it's not," Karen snapped. "This man is refusing to accommodate a paying passenger. I want him moved, or I want a refund." Herbert started to stand. "I can move to another seat if there's one available." "Sir, please don't feel pressured," Jessica said gently. "You're not violating any policies." "Ma'am, I can see if we have other seating options for you." "Why should I move?" Karen's voice rose another octave. "He's the one with the problem, living in some fantasy about his glory days. This is 2024, not 1970. Time to grow up." The words hit Herbert like a physical blow. His shoulders sagged slightly. not from shame, but from the familiar ache of being misunderstood by a world that had moved on while the memories remained frozen in time. Jessica's smile faltered. "Ma'am, I need to ask you to lower your voice and show respect for all passengers." "Respect?" Karen laughed bitterly. "Where's my respect? I paid full price for this seat." Meanwhile, 20 feet away in the cockpit, Captain Leonard Carter pulled off his headset and turned to his co-pilot, Mark Stevens. "How long has that been going on?" Carter asked, his jaw set firm. "About 8 minutes now," Stevens replied, checking his watch. "That woman's really going after the old guy." Carter's hands tightened on the controls. As a former Air Force pilot who'd served 2 deployments in Iraq, he'd seen too many veterans come home to civilian disrespect. "Mark," he said quietly, "I'm about to make an announcement." 9 minutes into the confrontation, Karen stood up abruptly, her voice carrying across the entire cabin. "Fine. Since nobody seems to care about paying customers anymore, I'm making this simple." She pointed directly at Herbert. "Either he moves that military garbage and switches seats, or I'm filing complaints with the airline, the FAA, and posting this whole thing online. This is discrimination against normal passengers." The cabin fell silent. Even the engine noise seemed to fade as 150 people held their breath. Herbert closed his book slowly, his calloused fingers steady despite the public humiliation. He looked up at Karen with the same calm expression he'd worn while under enemy fire decades earlier. "Ma'am, I won't move my friend's flag, but I'll gladly change seats if it helps you find peace." "Peace?" Karen's laugh was harsh, bitter. "You want peace? Stop dragging your dead friends onto airplanes and traumatizing normal people with your war guilt." The words landed like grenades in the cramped space. Maria Santos gasped audibly. "That's enough," she whispered, but not loud enough to challenge Karen directly. James Chen's fists clenched. His military brother had committed suicide 2 years after returning from Afghanistan, struggling with exactly this kind of civilian hostility. Near the back, an elderly woman named Dorothy Williams, a Gold Star mother who'd lost her son in Iraq, began quietly crying. Her daughter reached for her hand. College student David's phone was recording now. This felt historic, terrible, and necessary all at once. Young mother Rebecca Torres covered her 8-year-old son's ears, not wanting him to witness such cruelty. But flight attendant Jessica had reached her limit. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to return to your seat immediately. Your behavior is disrupting other passengers." "My behavior?" Karen's voice hit a new pitch. "I'm the victim here. This man is mentally unstable, clinging to dead people and war fantasies. Look at him. He's probably having flashbacks right now." Herbert's composure never cracked. He simply folded his hands in his lap and stared straight ahead, absorbing the attack with the discipline of someone who'd survived much worse. In the cockpit, Captain Carter had heard every cruel word through the intercom system. His knuckles were white against the control yoke. "That's it," he said to co-pilot Stevens. "I've heard enough." "Lenny, what are you thinking?" Stevens asked, recognizing the look in his captain's eyes. "I'm thinking that woman just crossed a line that doesn't get uncrossed," Carter replied, reaching for the intercom switch. "And I'm thinking it's time she learned what real authority looks like." The confrontation was about to shift dramatically. Comment below if you've ever had to stand up for what's right, even when it wasn't easy. Captain Leonard Carter's military service record spoke for itself. 15 years Air Force, 2 tours in Iraq, Distinguished Flying Cross, and a personal code that respect for veterans was non-negotiable. In 2007, during his second deployment, Carter had watched a young Marine sergeant lose both legs to an IED while protecting Iraqi civilians. That Marine, barely 22 years old, had apologized to Carter for causing trouble while being loaded onto a medical helicopter. The memory of that sergeant's humility in the face of devastating sacrifice had shaped Carter's understanding of true courage. And right now, listening to Karen's vicious attack on Herbert, every protective instinct in his military-trained mind was firing. "Mark," Carter said to his co-pilot, his voice steady but steel-edged, "I'm calling ground control." "What for?" Stevens asked, though he already suspected the answer. "Passenger disruption. We're returning to the gate." Stevens blinked. "Lenny, that's a big call. Delays, rescheduling, angry passengers." Some things matter more than schedules, Carter cut him off, already reaching for the radio. Ground control, this is Flight 447, requesting immediate return to gate. We have a passenger conduct issue requiring resolution. Copy Flight 447. Gate 27 is available. What's the nature of the disruption? Passenger harassment of a military veteran. I'm handling it personally. Carter switched to the cabin intercom, his voice filling every speaker on the aircraft. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We are returning to the gate due to a passenger conduct issue. I apologize for the inconvenience, but certain behaviors will not be tolerated on my aircraft. The cabin erupted in confused murmurs. Passengers checked their phones, wondering about connections and delays. Karen looked around wildly. Conduct issue? I'm the one being harassed by this mental case and his war relics. But Carter wasn't finished. I want to be crystal clear about something. His voice continued over the intercom, calm but unmistakably authoritative. This airline and this crew has zero tolerance for disrespect toward our military veterans. Zero. The plane banked slowly toward the terminal, and passengers felt the shift in altitude. Herbert sat motionless, unsure whether to feel grateful or embarrassed that his quiet suffering had caused such disruption. Karen's face had gone pale. They can't do this. They can't ground a plane because someone complained about a passenger. Flight attendant Jessica looked directly at her. Ma'am, the captain has absolute authority over this aircraft. When it comes to passenger safety and dignity, his word is final. The plane was heading back to the gate, and Karen's world was about to change dramatically. The plane came to a stop at gate 27, but Captain Carter wasn't waiting for ground crew or gate agents. The cockpit door opened with a firm click. Captain Leonard Carter stepped into the cabin wearing his full uniform, crisp white shirt, gold wings gleaming on his chest, 4 stripes marking his rank on his shoulders. At 6 feet tall, with graying temples and the bearing of someone accustomed to command, he commanded immediate attention. Every conversation stopped. Every phone lowered. Every passenger turned to watch. Carter walked slowly down the aisle, his polished shoes silent on the airplane carpet. His eyes were fixed on one destination, row 14, where Herbert Wallace sat quietly with his book closed, hands folded, waiting for whatever came next. Karen started to speak. Captain, finally someone with authority. This man has been. Carter's raised hand silenced her without a word or even a glance in her direction. His focus remained entirely on Herbert. When Carter reached row 14, he stopped directly in front of the elderly veteran. For a moment, the two men simply looked at each other. One in uniform, one in civilian clothes, both shaped by military service decades apart. Then Captain Carter did something that would be talked about for years. He came to attention, back straight, shoulders squared, chin level, and executed a slow, deliberate, perfect military bow. Not a casual nod, not a polite gesture. A full, formal bow of respect held for several seconds that felt like an eternity. The cabin became a vacuum of silence. Herbert's weathered face broke into the first smile anyone had seen from him all day. His eyes filled with tears he'd been holding back for 9 minutes of public humiliation. Maria Santos pressed her hand to her mouth, tears streaming down her cheeks. James Chen felt goosebumps rise on his arms as he thought of his brother who never received this kind of recognition. College student David's recording captured every second, knowing he was witnessing something extraordinary. Dorothy Williams, the Gold Star mother, sobbed quietly as she remembered her son's funeral, and how much this moment would have meant to him. Young Rebecca Torres whispered to her 8-year-old son, "That's what honor looks like, baby. Remember this." But the most dramatic reaction came from Karen herself. Her mouth opened and closed soundlessly. The color drained from her face as the reality hit her. She just spent 9 minutes publicly attacking a man that a decorated pilot was now honoring in front of 150 witnesses. Captain Carter straightened slowly, then spoke in a voice clear enough for the entire cabin to hear. "Sir, it would be my honor to personally ensure your comfort for the remainder of this flight. Thank you for your service to our country." Herbert's voice was thick with emotion. "Thank you, Captain. That means more than you know." Carter turned to face the cabin, his expression stern but controlled. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a seating adjustment to make before departure." His eyes found Karen, who was now staring at the floor. The captain's respect had just rewritten the entire flight's dynamic. The applause started from Maria Santos in 12C, 3 slow, deliberate claps that echoed through the silent cabin. Then James Chen joined her, his businessman's composure cracking as he thought of his brother's struggle with PTSD. Dorothy Williams, the Gold Star mother, clapped through her tears, whispering her son's name under her breath. Within seconds, the entire cabin erupted in sustained applause. Not the polite, scattered clapping of a typical flight announcement, but a thunderous, standing ovation that seemed to shake the aircraft itself. Herbert raised his hand gently, overwhelmed by the response. "Please, this isn't necessary," he said softly, but his voice was lost in the continuing ovation. The most stunning transformation belonged to Karen. She remained seated while everyone around her stood and clapped, her face cycling through emotions. Shock, embarrassment, shame, and finally something resembling understanding. The woman who'd called Herbert's flag military junk now stared at her hands, realizing she'd publicly attacked a man who deserved her respect, not her contempt. "I didn't know," she whispered to herself, the words barely audible above the applause. When the clapping finally subsided, Herbert stood slowly, his worn service cap in his hands. 37 years ago, Tommy Rodriguez and I were pinned down in a jungle outside Saigon, he said, his voice carrying clearly in the hushed cabin. He used his body to shield me from shrapnel. The last thing he said was, "Tell my mom I was brave." Every day since, I've tried to honor that request by living with the same courage he showed. His eyes found Karen's. "Ma'am, I hope you never have to learn about sacrifice the way Tommy and I did. But I also hope you'll remember that every veteran carries stories that shaped them. We're not asking for special treatment, just basic human dignity." Karen's voice was barely a whisper. "I'm sorry. I'm so deeply sorry." Herbert nodded graciously. Apology accepted. Then something remarkable happened. Across the cabin, other passengers began standing up, identifying themselves. "Vietnam veteran, 101st Airborne," called out a man in row 8. "Navy corpsman, Gulf War," said a woman near the back. "Army medic, Afghanistan," announced a young man in row 20. "Marine Corps, Iraq veteran," said another voice. One by one, nearly a dozen veterans revealed themselves, creating a community Herbert hadn't known existed around him. The flight that had begun with isolation and hostility had become a reunion of service members spanning 5 decades. Captain Carter watched from the aisle, his decision to intervene validated by the transformation unfolding before him. Share this story if you believe respect should never be optional, regardless of where you are or who's watching. When Flight 447 finally departed Atlanta, 45 minutes behind schedule, the cabin hummed with a completely different energy. Karen had quietly moved to an empty seat in the back, giving Herbert space while processing her own actions. She spent the flight writing in a notebook, working through thoughts she'd never had to confront before. The veterans who'd identified themselves found natural conversation flowing between rows. Herbert learned that Marine veteran Kevin Torres in row 20 had served in Fallujah, while Navy Corpsman Linda Shaw had treated wounded soldiers in field hospitals across Afghanistan. The hardest part, Herbert shared during one cross-aisle conversation, wasn't coming home from the war. It was feeling like the war never left me, while everyone else moved on. Linda nodded knowingly. 30 years of people thanking me for my service, then asking when I'm going to get over it and act normal. Young David, the college student who'd recorded the confrontation, approached Herbert mid-flight. "Sir, would you mind if I asked about your friend Tommy? I'm studying military history, and I'd like to understand better." Herbert spent 20 minutes sharing stories about Tommy Rodriguez, his humor, his loyalty, his sacrifice. David listened intently, taking notes, genuinely eager to learn, rather than simply record content. Rebecca Torres brought her 8-year-old son to meet Herbert. "This is Mr. Herbert," she told the boy. "He served our country when he was young, and he's still serving it by teaching us about courage." The child shook Herbert's hand solemnly. "Thank you for keeping us safe," he said with the sincerity only children possess. Herbert's eyes misted. "You're very welcome, son." Even the flight crew treated the remainder of the journey differently. Flight attendants checked on Herbert regularly, ensuring his comfort. Captain Carter made a point to greet him personally as passengers deplaned. "Captain," Herbert said during their brief conversation, "your father must have taught you well about respect." "Actually," Carter smiled, "it was sergeants like you who taught me everything that mattered." By the time they landed in New York, everyone aboard carried a piece of Herbert's quiet dignity with them. Maria Santos later volunteered at a veterans hospital. James Chen started donating to PTSD research in his brother's memory. David changed his major to military history. Even Karen sent Herbert a handwritten letter 3 weeks later, apologizing again and describing how the experience had changed her perspective on service and sacrifice. One flight, one moment of courage from a captain, and dozens of lives touched by the reminder that respect costs nothing but means everything. Herbert Wallace returned to his quiet life in suburban Virginia, but the ripples from Flight 447 continue spreading across the country. The airline crew's story reached military communities nationwide, reminding active service members and veterans that their sacrifices still matter to people willing to stand up for what's right. Captain Carter's decision proved that leadership isn't just about rank or position. It's about recognizing when silence becomes complicity. Here's the truth most people don't want to admit. Veterans like Herbert face Karen's attitude every single day. In grocery stores, restaurants, airports, and countless public spaces, their service gets dismissed as living in the past or seeking attention. Too many Americans have forgotten that freedom isn't free, and the people who paid that price deserve our gratitude, not our indifference. But Captain Carter showed us something powerful that day. When someone in authority chooses to honor rather than ignore, when they use their position to protect dignity rather than maintain convenience, everything changes. His bow wasn't just respect for Herbert, it was leadership that inspired an entire plane full of strangers to examine their own hearts. The real question isn't whether Herbert deserved that respect. Of course he did. The question is whether you and I have the courage to speak up when we witness disrespect happening around us. Maybe you'll never face a moment as dramatic as Flight 447, but you'll definitely encounter smaller opportunities. The veterans struggling with groceries, the elderly service member standing alone at a memorial, the military family dealing with deployment stress at a restaurant. Those moments mattered just as much. Captain Carter could have stayed in his cockpit, focused on flight schedules and passenger complaints. Instead, he chose to honor the man who'd served his country with the same dedication Carter brought to serving his passengers. That's the kind of leadership our world needs more of. People willing to ground planes, interrupt injustice, and bow down to recognize true courage. Because respect isn't a gesture you give when it's convenient. It's a choice you make when it matters most. Subscribe to Story by Liam for more stories where justice and respect win the day, and where ordinary people choose extraordinary courage.